Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those who on the East Coast. Thank you so much for joining us today. We truly appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us. I am Yewon Yu. I'm a member of the Informs Data Mining Society, which is organizing today's seminar. Um, and also a part of the 2025 Informs Ambassador Program, which is sponsoring this event. I would like to take a moment to thank our co-organizer Ying Lin from the University of Houston and Woody Ju from Carnegie Mellon University. Um, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Travis Weiland. Dr. Weiland is currently an assistant professor of mathematics education in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. His career in education began in Western North. He taught high school mathematics, and he earned his PhD degree in mathematics education from the University of Massachusetts. Um, Dr. Weiland's research is centered on improving statistical education in schools, especially by exploring socio-political issues and collaborating with teachers to co-create effective learning environments. So today's webinar title is Culturally Relevant Pedagogy in Teaching Data-Centric Courses. I'm so excited to hear Dr. Weiland's insight on this interesting topic. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Travis Weiland.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today to chat with y'all. The slides I have available, I have a bit.ly link and a QR code if you want to scan them. And then I'll put that at the end again as well for those that enter later on, and I'll drop it in the chat as well. So if anybody's interested in the slides, I'm happy to share them. So I will say that this is a slightly different audience than I'm typically used to talking to. So I'll kind of position things a little bit. So a lot of what I'm going to present today is some work that I did with a good friend and colleague of mine, Emmanuel Williams, where we were trying to think of ways that we could kind of translate some of the educational theories that we see in K-12 environments into more kind of undergraduate and graduate statistics and data science courses in particular. And so we published that about a year ago in the Journal of Statistics and Data Science Education. It's freely available if you all want to take a look at it. And so what I'll do today is I'll talk through some of the things that we talked about there to kind of make it practical. So provide some theory, but also really make it practical to teaching. And then I'll try to pull in some things from projects that I've done over the years to give you some tangible examples and then connect to some of the resources that I draw upon when I'm doing this in my instruction. And again, leave plenty of time for questions. So I'm happy to answer any questions that y'all have. And you're welcome to drop things in the chat as we're going along. So I know we kind of have a wide range of expertise and audience in this group, be it data mining or operations research, management sciences, data science. I come heavily from mathematics and statistics, but there's kind of some common ground that I want to kind of position and that I'm going to kind of aim the talk towards, which is this idea that we all really care about data and we all really care about making good decisions with data. Now, what the context of that is and how we work with the data or the types of data that we deal with might vary, but I think that's kind of core across the different disciplines represented in this audience. And so that's what I'm going to kind of focus in on. So, like I said, I draw a lot from statistics, which is, one of the kind of bases of a lot of the fields that we draw upon. And something that is something that I always talk about with mathematics teachers, because that's my frequent audience, is that you can't do things with data without context. And I always go back to this Cobb and Moore quote where they talk about data or numbers in context. So it's part of the whole process. How we collect the data, the questions we ask, how we analyze the data, the decisions or interpretations that we come up with. We're constantly connecting to context with this, whether it's our own contextual knowledge or it's our colleagues or collaborators on the work that we're doing that we're constantly kind of dialoguing with over these things. There's always some sort of context in what we're doing. And the data itself, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? We know that it's socially, culturally, and historically situated in different ways data changes over time, in which it was collected, how it was collected, who it was collected by. These are all important aspects when we deal with any kind of data in the fields that we're in. But when we think about the questions that we often ask in class, and I actually used AI to help me generate some of these, they're often more focused on specific skills, particular algorithms or models that we're focusing on. It's usually a little bit more in the theory and abstraction land is where we end up teaching. And one of the things that I really try to spend a lot of time thinking about then is how do we bring more of that context into what we're teaching? How do we make sure that we're kind of showing students the actual inquiry process that we frequently go through when we're dealing with data in different ways? And a big imbalance that I often see in this is that if you think about most of our jobs with data, we probably spend 80% of our time just finding and processing the data in different ways, and then maybe like 10% of the time actually analyzing it. But when we think about what we often do in instruction is we spend the vast majority of our instructional time talking about analysis and a little bit of interpretation, and usually not as much of the processing side. And so that's an element that I'm going to kind of encourage that we kind of make apparent a little bit more. So I'm just going to give you all a minute to kind of reflect on these, and I'll read through them. And this is a way to kind of think about how are we dealing with data, or how do we think about data in our classes. So anytime you're dealing with teaching, reflection is a super crucial part of it. So how much time do you spend explaining a context or an issue of a data set, or what kind of background information do you provide? How often do the tasks that you give your students in your class actually require them to understand the context or to connect to that issue? How much time do you spend finding or creating data sets that are relevant to your students? And how often have you had a student ask you, when are they ever going to use this based on what you're teaching them? So these are kind of reflective questions that I keep in mind whenever I'm teaching courses that are drawing heavily upon data, is these kind of four big questions. And I'm going to spend some time today kind of unpacking how can you maybe delve into these in different ways and respond in ways in the future that lead to you're spending more time on relevant issues, you're spending more time with the data and the context, and also acknowledge the challenges in that. This is challenging to do. This is challenging work. So the main kind of educational theory or educational background that we draw upon in this paper is what's referred to as culturally relevant pedagogy. So this has been around for a while. Ladson Billings is kind of the originator of this. And she did this work back in the early 90s. So we're talking 30 years ago. It's very much heavily infused into K-12 education. Typically pre-service teachers read this book or have read at least an article about culturally relevant pedagogy. And it was done predominantly in math classrooms, but it's been translated to really every discipline I can think of at this point in different ways. And it's infused into higher ed in more and more ways as well, as we've seen the merit of it. But the main thing that I'm going to kind of point out, and then we'll unpack a little bit, is there's really three main kind of propositions that Ladson Billings talks about. So the first one being students need to experience academic success. I'm not going to spend as much time talking about that one because I think that's one that's kind of a starting basis. I mean, that's what most people focus on when they're teaching is how do we position our students to experience success in what they're doing. The two trickier ones are B and C. So how do you develop and maintain cultural competence with students? And then the third one being students developing a critical consciousness, this idea of challenging the status quo. And that one in particular is one of the most challenging ones to do. So when we talk about cultural competence, this term is used widely. So if you Googled cultural competence, the different fields take it up in different ways. In educational settings, typically how we think about it is that you have some competence as to the students and what cultures they're coming from. So that could be, based on the communities that they come from, based on maybe their ethnic cultural background, the community knowledge bases, epistemologies, things like that. And in general, we usually talk about it in terms of, for teaching, you need to have a general kind of openness for different ways of knowing. People are going to come in with different ways of thinking about things. They're going to come in with different views on what it means to know something. Being open to that and open to discussion around that is important aspects of cultural competence. Another kind of genre of educational theory that really elevates this cultural competence and provides a lot of pragmatic steps too is something called culturally responsive teaching. There's a lot of overlap between these two theories. Sometimes they're used interchangeably. I'm mostly pointing this out to say if you hear one of the two, usually you're hearing like the same things. Um, the main difference between how people talk about culturally responsive teaching and culturally relevant pedagogy is that critical consciousness. And that's honestly where a lot of the controversy with these theories usually draws from. And that's because critical consciousness is very much rooted in kind of critical theories and neo-Marxist perspectives, which, depending on the setting and with the current political climate, can very much be considered something controversial. So the general idea behind critical consciousness, and a lot of this comes from Paulo Freire's work in kind of rural Brazilian literacy work back in the 70s and 80s, is this idea that you're developing an understanding of how to make sense of the world through kind of your general technical ways of knowing things, right? So you learn your disciplinary norms, you learn statistics, you learn data science, you learn those kind of practices. But you're also thinking about how do you kind of critique the world? How do you question what the status quo or what the norms are in the group, norms of how we do things, with this aim towards kind of more just futures. So with these things in mind, what I want to do is spend some time kind of unpacking how we might see this already. So there's already conversations in our disciplines about these kind of critical perspectives. Data feminism, if you're familiar with it, so this is a work coming out of MIT scholars D'Ignazio and Klein, really thinking about like feminist theories intersected with different data-based work. And so they have 7 main principles that they talk about that I think layer in very nicely to the work that we do. One is this idea of examining power. So part of the way that we see power is just in the availability of data, but also what kind of analyses can we do with that data? What perspectives does that kind of put forth? Challenging that power. So what's absent, who's absent, how do we maybe use the data in different ways to empower people or change things? This idea of emotion and embodiment, and this is one that, you know, as scientists, we often try to kind of separate ourselves from with this more kind of objective aim. But the reality is that when we're communicating data and when we are trying to make decisions, emotions are a part of that. And actually, a lot of the psychology work that is out there on how do people interpret data or how do people make sense of data-based arguments tells us that emotions actually overrule logic more than anything else. And we talk about this in different biases that we teach, but the reality is that emotions are part of it because it's humans communicating to humans. And so acknowledging that and actually thinking about that in the processes that we do is a really important part in communicating data. There's also this idea of kind of questioning binaries or hierarchies. So common ones that we think about are how do we define social constructs? So this is one we hear about currently, right? The government has kind of redefined what counts as sex or gender, where we only have sex and it's only 2 categories, even though that's biologically incorrect based on science. So how do we question these binaries and rethink how do we categorize things? We have to categorize things. That's and quantify. That's part of what we do in our different genres. That's powering in certain ways because it gives us information, but it also erases certain perspectives too. So just being aware of those things. This idea of pluralism, different interpretations, different ways of looking at things. Context, again, we need to make sense of it. And then this other side of making labor visible is kind of going back to like what I said. There's so many different aspects of work that goes into data that we often don't show students that I think is a really important thing for us to think about opening up a little bit more. Another perspective that relates to a lot of the work that we do that I think has a little bit more of this critical kind of questioning to it is Cathy O'Neill's work when she wrote about weapons of math destruction, which I think this is almost a decade old now, where she was really talking about how big data and algorithms in a lot of ways re-perpetuate the biases that we see, and she provides a lot of different examples there. So again, really thinking carefully about some of these things. So I don't think that this idea of critical consciousness or questioning the status quo is necessarily new by any means to data-centric kind of disciplines, but I do think it's something that we don't always translate over into our teaching is an important aspect of that, and again falls under this umbrella of culturally relevant pedagogy. So let's kind of get into some pragmatics. Like, so we have this theory, this educational theory. What does this mean in my day-to-day for what I'm trying to do in teaching? And uh, in that pragmatic perspective, I really try to think of, well, what are some first steps that you can take with this, right? Like all of a sudden trying to develop critical consciousness in students like tomorrow isn't pragmatically a possibility, right? It's not a reality. But what can you do to start to move towards this if that's a thing that you want to do? And where I usually lean on is that word relevance, like culturally relevant pedagogy. Well, let's start with relevance. Let's start with what do my students find relevant and how can I at least start to connect to that in different ways, which often ties in very tightly with kind of cultural competence. And then you can build that towards kind of, thinking of critical consciousness if that's a thing you want to do in your instruction. The other word that keeps coming up frequently in here is the idea of culture. And uh, what does that mean, right? So if it's cultural competence or culturally relevant or culturally responsive, what do we mean when we use the word culture? Um, as somebody that deals with data, I like definitions of things, right? These kind of nebulous, vague constructs. Give me a definition that I can start to operationalize. So I go to UNESCO because that's kind of a broad, internationally accepted definition of culture, where they talk about it as a distinctive set of spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features of society or social groups that encompasses not only art and literature, but we also think about lifestyles, ways of living together, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. So there's a lot that's in there. And there's a lot of ways that we can pull culture into the classroom. And one of the reasons why I try to highlight that is to say it's actually not super difficult to find ways to bring culture in. The tricky part is actually trying to figure out what your students' cultures are to bring that aspect into it, which I'll talk more about as we move along here. So let's think about how does culture and data relate together? What's the intersection here? Because that's most of what we deal with. We see this in a lot of ways, right? So what are the variables or attributes that are in a data set and how do we operationalize them? How are these things being measured? Particularly if we're measuring people, right? If we're collecting data on people, we're always operationalizing these social constructs that are inherently made up, right? So some of them are useful, some of them might not be, and it connects back to the question that we're dealing with. How we collected the data, who gets included, who gets excluded, who's not collected on, what's not collected on. And we see a lot of cases with this too. Data takes time, it takes money, right? It's valuable in a lot of ways. And so just what data is present and easily available starts to show us like what do we value in our culture and society and making sense of. When we get into analyzing the data, making decisions, again, that's based on cultural norms, right? So if we're going to make a decision on what's going to work in this particular group with this particular audience, we have to know that group and that audience to be able to think about, well, how does this work best for them, for these people in this situation? And this idea that we're creating stories with data, right? I think that's a pretty common way of talking about it today, but that's relatively new. Like if you talk 10 years ago, most people weren't talking about telling stories with data, they were talking about interpreting data, analyzing data, kind of a very kind of objective view of it. I think more now we've started to open up to the fact that there's not anything really objective per se about data, but data is really useful. So how do we balance that? So these are different ways that culture already creeps into the practices that we do. How do we highlight those in the classroom? This perspective here that I'm going to kind of show, and then I'm going to get into some like more nitty gritty details. These kind of two quotes are part of what I use to try to make sense of what I'm doing on a daily basis. So one is this metaphor of windows and mirrors, which is a pretty common one in education, where this idea of a mirror is you can see yourself in the curriculum in certain ways. So that might be I'm part of this data set, or I can see the community I come from in this data set. This is connected to me somehow. And then windows where you're seeing different views on the world. And it's important to provide both of those. So when I talk about relevance and culturally relevant, that doesn't mean that we only create mirrors for students, because that becomes problematic, like what we see in social media, where we have echo chambers and all we're doing is seeing the reflections of ourselves. We're not being introduced to different perspectives. But if we're only ever seeing windows, then we might not see ourselves as being part of what we're doing. That sense of belonging or inclusion that we know is really important to bring in diverse voices into the practice and to kind of diversify the people that we have in our audience. The other side of this is inclusive design. So we've seen this more and more in higher ed, where you're talking about things like universal design for learning, so UDL principles. If you have a center for teaching and learning or faculty development on your campus, this is probably something that they will talk to faculty about and do professional development on. But we're also seeing this talked about more specifically in statistics and data science, these ideas of, how do you make your course materials inclusive of diverse learners? So some of these things have to do with, like, what color palettes should you use on data visualization so somebody that's colorblind is able to differentiate things? Or how do we add metadata to figures that you're putting in here so people can find sources for that? Or if I'm speaking, can I add captions so that people can read what I'm saying instead of just hearing what I'm saying? So all different ways that we can kind of be more inclusive in that design. But a lot of this comes down to, and I always boil this down to, if you talk to older educators, what they found is most important, and that's who your students are matter. And so we should figure out that as much as we can, and then use that to drive our instructional decision making. So from a data-centric perspective, right, we want to have data on our students to know who they are, and we want to use that data to make decisions in our teaching. So one of the ways that we can do this is we can think about, okay, what are common ways in statistics that we collect data that has to do with cultural groups or group affiliation? And we outlined, I think, 3 times as many of these in the paper if you're interested in more. But these are some super common ones, right? And these are things that we see in polling data, in demographic backgrounds, for pretty much anything that you collect data on people. So these are some common starting points that you can start with and say, hey, you've probably filled out a form that has blah on it. Let's talk about that. Let's unpack that in different ways. So that could be on the data collection side. Then you can also analyze data sets that have these attributes within them. And that opens up ways that, again, you can start to make some connections to students or create spaces for them to see themselves in the data. Now, a lot of what I'm going to do is provide suggestions, because I'll be honest, I know that with the current political climate, depending where you work and teach, some of these things you can talk about more freely and some of them you can't. It's the reality in which we live in today. And so think of which of these work best for your environment and also what you're comfortable with. I would never encourage somebody to talk about something that they haven't spent some time thinking about themselves, particularly in some of the more controversial issues that we deal with. It's really important to have done some self-reflection and self-work on those things. The other thing I want to highlight is that sometimes people say, well, it sounds like everything is culture. And in some ways, yes. Everything that we construct is somehow connected to culture because it's us constructing, it's humans constructing it. What I try to highlight more is that we're already probably infusing culture into our classroom without even realizing it. What we might not be cognizant about or doing well is making sure that that's relevant to the students in our classroom. So a common example is, I mean, everybody's probably had a stats professor like this at some point, or has a colleague like this, or maybe this is you. Love sports, so much data on sports. I mean, we have a whole field of sports analytics now because of that, right? And so you'll get somebody that's really passionate about sports, and that's the only thing that they teach to their class, which is really great for the students in the room that really love sports. And then there's the other students in the room that are like, I don't care anything about sports whatsoever, that are left just disconnected from what's happening. So what I say that to say, and going back to that windows and mirrors metaphor, is that there are opportunities for us to present mirrors and to present windows. How do we balance that out? So how do we think about ways that we can maybe switch up some of the examples that we're providing, and not just provide one example, but several examples, so that we optimize how much we're providing opportunities for students to see themselves in the data that we're dealing with in classes, but also seeing opportunities to see new perspectives, new things, because that's of course what we're trying to do in the academy, is open up their minds to different views and different perspectives. So part of how we tried to make some stepping stones with this, aside from some pragmatics of like where do you find data and how do you do this in your classroom, is also we came up with this definition of culturally relevant data, because we found this as an easy starting point. So this idea of let's make things relevant to students, great. Now we're teaching data-centric classes, so we need data, and that's one of the main ways that we can bring in context, we can bring in issues that are relevant. And so we talk about culturally relevant data as being structured data sets, and really thinking about this in kind of like the tidy data kind of idea of where your rows are representing the things that you're measuring and your columns represent the different variables that you're measuring on this group, whatever that is. It could be widgets, it could be computers, it could be people. People work best with connecting with other people, so that's a good topic. But again, depending on your audience and what you're training them for, you might be talking about other things. The other side of this is then, again, these two criterion that we talk about. It's got to be relevant in relation to either something students care about, their communities or cultures, or some issue of justice that impacts a community or culture. And again, how you want to address this is really up to your comfort levels. I usually don't tell people, like, if you've never done anything relevant like this before, don't jump into the water with like, I'm going to do social justice stuff tomorrow, because there's a lot of stuff you kind of have to read through and think about before doing that. And it can be very challenging in a setting. Start with, I've never taught about this context and it seems relevant to my students. Let's find some data and test that out. So that's a starting point to work with. If you want to move into the social justice work, then you can move from that as you get more comfortable, do a fair bit of work thinking about that particular construct or issue yourself, and then how do you connect that to your students and be aware of the pitfalls, which I'll mention some of those towards the end. So I want to provide an example, and this is one that I've done before. I'll unpack a little bit, and then I'll go through some sources of data that I found pretty useful to bring kind of cultural relevance to students into the classroom, but for different settings, because I know the context that you all deal with the issues that are relevant probably vary drastically. And then from that, I'll talk a little bit about some pedagogical aspects to think about in the classroom, and then kind of end with some time for questions. So an example that I've probably used the most in my career is traffic stops. So specifically, being in Charlotte, I'm able to access this from the city of Charlotte has publicly available data on their traffic stops, which they update fairly regularly for a city. Finding live updated data from a city is very unusual and very challenging, but they do a decent job of updating things. So one of the reasons that we use this traffic stop data is that many students have experienced a traffic stop at some point in their lives. And it's one of the most common ways that we're seeing in the news of interactions between people and police that turn deadly. So it's already something that students are, if they haven't experienced a traffic stop themselves, they probably know somebody that has, and they're hearing about it on the news and in the media frequently. So it's an opportunity to kind of bring an issue in. And this is more of a social justice oriented issue here, certainly. There's a lot of data and research that shows that traffic stops disproportionately are affecting people of color. And so that's research that you can bring into your classroom that's been done scientifically over decades, so that you can use that as a basis for some of these analyses. So with this, we'll delve into the data. I'm typically working with folks that are going into not necessarily data-centric careers. So a lot of times I'm working in service classes, right? So we'll do random samples of 5,000 of these cases, because there's like 100-some thousand a year traffic stops in Charlotte. And then we use kind of data visualization tools so that they can create pictures, see descriptive statistics, start to make sense of it. So this is a way for us to really show the data. We talk about how it's collected. So we show them the form that the police officers use to actually record this data, which brings up interesting conversations like, how do they know the driver's race? Because it's not on the driver's license. Where it is, though, is it's on the form and it's phrased as apparent race. And so we talk about, what the police officer does is they check what they think is the race of the driver based on appearance. And this, of course, starts to bring up questions of, how are you measuring things? How do you operationalize things? How do you answer questions off this? So if I care about the person's racial identity, the driver's racial identity, I really need to ask them or see some sort of form that they've filled out, right? It's a self-report thing, though. In this case, though, if we're worried about there being bias in traffic stops, it's actually the perceptions of the police officer doing the stopping that's more important. So this idea of apparent race to the police officer is actually a better measure of race than what the driver would self-report as. And so we have these discussions with students over, if this is what we're trying to explore and how we want to measure the data, how we operationalize things matter. How we organize the data matters. What categories are available matters. And then we can go through and do analyses with these things. Now, this works great for Charlotte. You might want something more local. You can look at your own local kind of jurisdictions. Some of them are really good at reporting things, some aren't. There's also the Stanford Open Policing Project, which has been around for like several decades now. That kind of serves as a general warehouse of data for many states. So you can see there, the ones highlighted in blue, they have some data for. So there's, of course, places that are absent. Some places don't systematically collect the data, which again is a whole conversation you can have with your students over the availability of data, what variables, how are they measured, because each jurisdiction gets to do it differently. Lots of great data conversations around a topic that can be considered relevant to students in a lot of different ways and can delve into social justice issues if that's a space that you want to go into. So that's kind of an example of here's a culturally relevant data set, here's places that you can get that from, and a little talking about how we delve into it. What you got to do for your students, though, is figure out what's relevant to your students. So I have found traffic stops to be relevant to my students, or at the very least, it's an issue they should spend some time thinking about because it's in the media. But trying to figure out what's relevant to your students can be really challenging, especially because as we deal with our undergraduate classes, we have very diverse student bases, right? We have students that are international, coming from all different kind of cultural backgrounds. We have first generation students. We have veteran students. We have students that are coming from, families where everybody's gone to college or nobody's gone to college. And so these are all different lived experiences that our students come in with. There's also a temporal factor. I don't want to say my age per se, but it's been a while since I've been in an undergraduate class. What's relevant to undergrads now versus when I was an undergrad is very different. And so I really need to talk to them in different ways to get to know that. So some of the techniques that we've used or we've found useful for this is one, you can just survey your class, right? We love to collect data, send out a survey. So think about wordings of things. You could collect demographic data, but also just asking questions like, what's your hobby? What do you spend time on outside of class? What issues are important to you? Gives you some sense of who's in the room and what might be some issues that you can try to engage or bring into the classroom. Community walks is another good one. So to give you some perspective on that, that would be going around and walking around the community that your students come from. Now, in our diverse communities, that typically means your kind of common community would be your college campus. If you're super familiar with that, then you don't even have to do this. You already have ways to connect from your college campus. But if you're one of those faculty members, like I've been at times where you're like, I know where the parking deck is and how to get to where my office is, and that's about it. It's an opportunity to get out around the campus and see what are issues that are relevant to the students. Spend time talking to your students before and after class. Some classes are easy to do than others, right? If you're in a 600-person lecture hall, getting a chance to talk to students can be very challenging in that setting. But even if you spend just 10 minutes before class standing outside the door just saying hello to people and getting a little bit of background on them, or when I'm dealing with classes kind of under 100 and I can put them in groups, I spend time walking around during that group work and kind of listening to their conversations and asking them questions about things. And you get to learn a lot about your students that way. Another way you can learn what's interesting to your students is office hours. And now I know you're probably thinking office hours. Well, nobody shows up to my office hours. So a technique I've seen some people do is actually they will provide extra credit if somebody comes to their office hours in the first 2 weeks. Here's the rationale behind that. One is sometimes students are don't know what to go to office hours for, or they're just scared to go find your office, right? That can be a barrier for some students. And so kind of providing that extra incentive and saying, you don't have to come for anything in particular, just come say hello. We might chat for a couple minutes, is a much more low stakes way of kind of bringing students into your office and getting them comfortable with, you as a human and somebody they can interact with, so that then later in the semester, when they do have an issue, they do have a question, you've kind of already broken down that barrier and made them comfortable with, like, hey, I'm here, come see me. But that's also an opportunity to get to know your students. So I've had colleagues that do this, and I've done this, and your students will come talk to you about all sorts of things, and volunteer information, sometimes more than you want to hear at times. But it's ways to get to know them, get to connect to them, and find out what's relevant to them. So then you can start to think about, how do I bring this into the classroom, perhaps, or how do I bring these issues up? Other ways that I try to use are what's current events in the newspaper today, right? And I'm not talking about like a physical one. I'm talking about digital news media, social media, things like that. What are the big issues that are coming up right now? How can I pull some of those into the classroom? Because students are hearing about these things too. Let's talk about it. Community activists are great for this too. I've worked with a lot around food access, because that's a huge issue for our students, either K-12 or in the undergraduate and graduate settings, is food access. So talking about what are food access issues? How can we bring this in data into the classroom? If you're not in social sciences, so if you live in like a disciplinary department like I do, go talk to the social science folks, talk to the historians, talk to the philosophers. What are the issues that are going on right now? Sometimes they're the ones that are reading this and are the experts on it, and you can get a lot of great ideas from them too. So then how do you find the data, right? Like, we spend all sorts of inordinate amounts of time finding data. My most common source, honestly, is governmental data sets. I like them for a lot of reasons. One, they're freely available. Two, they're generally on people, right? The government is collecting information either on people or the country in different ways. So there's a lot of relevancy that connects to that, but they're also very well documented. There's great metadata, the methodologies are clear, you can see all the data collection tools, like everything's right there that you can show students the different aspects of it. So data.gov is great for this, census data, and I'll kind of talk through some of these examples. I never used to have to do this, but there's a caveat now. We have issues with federal data disappearing or getting changed right now. So I will say federal data is great. However, things that you used to use might not be available anymore, or you might have to go to other sources for them, or they might have changed things in them. To be aware of this, but I still think these are good conversations that our students should hear about, because data is really important. We care about data. The availability of data is important. It's part of the scientific endeavor. So how do we share these things with our students and still talk about these things, even if there's absence at times? So data.gov, 309,000 some data sets connected there, tons of data. This is a great starting point that you can kind of go off from. Again, you'll get bombarded with data. It can be kind of sensory overload at times. That's why coming in with specific things you're looking for will help refine that. But this is a great way to kind of get started, is this broad kind of data.gov search. Ones that I've found that you can kind of drill down into a little bit more, and I find these are sometimes less controversial to bring into students, is stuff from NOAA or USGS. There's a lot of great weather data out there, water flows, and you can connect this to climate events. Pretty much everyone has experienced some sort of kind of climate change drastic event at some point recently, whether it's wildfires, flooding, from torrential rains, or from hurricanes, freak tornadoes. There's just too many things to count. These are ways that we can kind of show data on some of those things. In general, too, hydrologists do a really good job of kind of making available data, and they've made a number of different kind of lessons that go along with some of these things too. So some great connections there that you can pull in, and you can keep it very scientific, so to speak, on just, what are some of the issues, but you can also delve into issues of, climate change, what's causing it, what do we need to be thinking about, how do we start to harden structures for this? So making decisions based on data, right? Census data is fabulous, and if you're not familiar with IPMS, it's a really great resource for census data and other data sets. They're out of, I think it's University of Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken. They do a really nice job of kind of warehousing data. So a lot of this is governmental data, but they've done a job where you can kind of download the data from them and they will stitch data sets together for you. So do the joining for you so you don't have to. They'll do different spatial layers with some of these things too, depending on what they have. They have international data, they can harmonize. So they do a lot of that processing cleaning work for you in a lot of ways that you can do some interesting analyses from it. And again, it's all freely available, which is fantastic. Another source that I go to for more educationally related things is the Civil Rights Data Collection. The future of this is, I guess, somewhat questionable because it's through the Department of Education, and we may or may not have that in the future. But for now, we do have this data. Students that are parents have thought about schools and thinking about equal access and education. Everybody's been through the educational system in one way, shape, or form, or teaching in educational systems. So there's always a lot of relevance that are there. You can see things like access to advanced placement courses, what are the demographics in different sites, what kind of um, uh, credentialed teachers are there. Teacher shortages is a huge issue. Suspensions, IEPs, all sorts of stuff like that you can look at through this data. And then one that's kind of more on the international level is if you're familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which there's 17 of them, they touch pretty much every industry and field out there in some way, shape, or form. They have started collecting data pretty systematically, and they put it in what's called the UN Data Commons. And they have one specifically for the Sustainable Development Goals. They have indicators, so each of these goals has usually like 5 to 10 indicators, and they have metrics for each of those internationally. There's of course holes in the data because some countries collect data better than others, or some don't collect it at all, or some won't share it. But again, these bring up conversations. Everything that they have is freely available. You can download the raw data in a tidy format, so it's easy to kind of bring into the classroom. And again, you can connect to issues that might be of most interest to your students. I've at times just polled my students on which of these they find the most impactful or the most important, and then use that to go find indicators to draw upon. Other ways you can collect data. So data journalism is a huge thing now. I mean, we see it in very refined forms that never used to exist. And we can see this through sites like ProPublica, New York Times, Washington Post. Quite a few of these larger kind of newsrooms have data journalists where you have kind of disciplinary experts on creating data visualizations, people experts on coding, but they also use tricks like, well, it's not really a trick, Freedom of Information Act to collect public information, but then they put it into a format where you can actually do analyses with it, right? So putting that data into that tidy format for you. And they make a lot of those data sets freely available in their reporting that they're doing as well. And then there's also data set search tools. So ProPublica, I think, is a great one because they partner with local news stations a lot of times to do these. So you can oftentimes find very localized issues. They also, through their FOIA requests, often create these databases where you can search things like what's your state or institution, what's the school that you're looking at. Spatially, you can find where do I live. This one in particular, the cancer industrial air pollution one, that's a fun one to look at and sometimes depressing. And most of their data is publicly available and their methodologies are very transparent. 538 is another really good one. They started off, Nate Silver doing a lot of sports analytics stuff. They've shifted more into kind of polling things now, and then ABC News has kind of pulled them in. Great polling data though, and polling data is one of the most common ways that people experience data in their day-to-day lives. So this is a great way to kind of pull in kind of current event issues and talk about, you know, the issues around this, margins of error, confidence intervals, all that good stuff. How you ask a question changes how people respond. Great conversations there. The New York Times is also pretty good. So they're much more data visualization driven. So more of what you're going to find there is data visualizations, but those can be a good starting point to then track down the data behind them because they usually do source that pretty well. So in these cases, like you can see, this is sourced through the NIL and open doors and the dates and everything. So you could go Googling for those things and you can usually find the data with some persistence to connect to those. And those data visualizations can be great kind of launches or initial kind of capture your students' attention as they come into the room, and then dive into the data to do the more analytical things that you need to do in your course content. Kaggle is a great search tool. GitHub I didn't put on here because I figured that one was probably, most of you probably use GitHub pretty frequently. And then sometimes people don't realize Google actually has a data set search tool. Now, the issues that you deal with, you know, Google searches or GitHub or Kaggle, right, is that everybody posts everything. And so there's not quality control. So you have to go through and do some of that versus governmental data. You can usually trust the quality control. Most reputable data journalism, the quality control is pretty solid too. So there's less on you to kind of have to vet those things. You still have to explore the data and figure out what's in there, but it's a little more trustworthy, I guess, so to speak. You can also create data, right? I mean, we create data in our professions typically. So you can create data specifically for your course on an issue. This is, of course, time consuming. So how much of that you want to do. If you survey your class, that's one way to do it. But another common way of creating data is to actually go have your students create data. So maybe there's issues that are salient to them. They want to go do some survey data, or they want to collect measurements on things. Depending on your course, what kind of time you have, that can be a great project to incorporate in so that your students have some space to kind of go find their own issues, right? It's not on me to figure out what's relevant to them. It's just on me to give them space to go explore things that are relevant to them, but then give them feedback on what they're doing, how they're doing it. Again, that's a lot of work. That's no easy feat to kind of manage that many little micro projects, but it can be an opportunity where students can really start to connect to issues that are important to them. So then implementation side, and I leave this kind of at the notes level because how we implement varies so drastically based on our setting. You know, some of us might be teaching classes where we have like 5 grad students, and others are teaching, you know, 1,000 students in a lecture hall. So these are some kind of like top level notes that I generally give if you're going to try to engage in kind of making work relevant for your students. One is be prepared to deal with misunderstandings and mistakes. And part of this is just a humbleness, right? When you're delving into contextual issues that you're not an expert in, you're going to miss things. You're going to see different explanations from students. Just be humble on the fact that, hey, we're all learning together, right? Which is that second one. Just be open to learning with your students. You have an expertise in certain aspects of what we're doing, certainly like the disciplinary side of things, but how you make decisions in the contexts that you might be exploring, you might not be as much of an expert in. That's fine, and acknowledge that to students because that's the reality of most of what we do. We typically work on teams with multiple experts in different areas for that very reason, right? So letting students kind of see that and learn that too. Point out the limitations to data. I think sometimes we give data kind of this omniscient status where it's, you know, it knows everything. There's always limitations to data. So just point those out, be clear about them. Listening is a huge one, and this can be really challenging depending on what setting you're on, but listen to your students and what they're finding interesting in this, but also how are they thinking about these things? How are they understanding the content in relation to the context that you're doing? The other thing that I've learned over the years is that it's important to spend time on the context itself. It's not usually one of our learning objectives that's in our syllabus or things of that nature, but it's an important part of any data-based inquiry process. And so actually creating space to actually do a little bit of context learning as a part of exploring the data is really important. And then agency for your students. And this can come in a lot of different ways. One is go find your own data and explore this, but it could be as simple as I gave you a publicly available data set to kind of keep us focused, but you pick the question you're going to explore and then how you're going to model that. So how are there different ways that we can provide agency for students in this space to explore these data sets that they're going to use in different ways? And then the pitfalls. There's always pitfalls. So when you're dealing with contextualized things, you're dealing with culture, you really want to avoid kind of essentializing groups and normalizing things. And we deal with this anytime we interpret data, right? Don't overgeneralize, don't overstate your claims. Same thing when we're dealing with people, the same idea. Another issue that can come into play is that if you're in like a predominantly white institution and you only have 1 or 2 students of color in your classes, don't position them as representatives of their group. And now that could be, you know, I'm talking about racial representation, but that could be, you know, read that across any kind of lines of, you know, SES or gender or whatever. Don't rush on unpacking the context, but the flip side of that is don't switch contexts all the time. And I think that's an important one to point out. I've found usually for a semester long class, 2 to 3 different issues and data sets that I really dig into, but I don't try to switch it around constantly. The switching it around constantly is benefits of you might get more context in there that might be more relevant to your students. The flip side is the students never have time to really dig into any of them, make sense of them. So 2 or 3 that really kind of cover the bases as much as possible is a really great way to kind of create relevance for your students, but give them the actual time to dig in and get to know the data. Some of these data sets can be large too, so it takes a while just to wrap your head around it. Um, and then another one to kind of be aware of that I'll end with on the pitfalls is that um, depending on some of these issues, they can be triggering for students. And so just being sensitive to that doesn't necessarily mean avoid the issue, but it does mean, be sensitive in how you talk about it, how you present it, and just be aware of what issues might be triggering for certain students. Even things that might seem generic, like the weather, can have very triggering effects for certain students. Like here in Western North Carolina, we had Helene came through, and I mean, biblical flooding washed entire villages off the face of the earth. So, even just talking about heavy rainfall or flooding or things like that, even though it might seem innocuous to you, could be very traumatizing to a student that's lived through an experience like that. So just be aware is all I'm saying with that. These are some reflections that I give. Looking at time, I want to provide some time for questions, and I'll share these slides. I think of these more as questions that I think about it towards the end of a course to kind of think about what am I going to do next time. The main thing I'll just highlight here is that reflection in teaching is important for any teaching that you're doing, right? And then there's also some additional resources and links in here if you're interested in delving into some of these difficult conversations. It's a great kind of starting point for some self-work in that. So yes, with that, I want to make sure I end on time. If you missed it, there's the bit.ly link with the slides. So you're welcome to take a look at them in your leisure, if you have leisure time. And yes, thank you so much for coming on a Friday morning / afternoon to hear or talk about these things. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to drop them in the chat.
Thank you so much, Travis. It was really insightful and interesting talk. And especially, I really love the part that the reflection question that you shared earlier in the seminar webinar. I didn't really think about that. I don't think I really gave enough time to explain the data, think more about the data. I just throw the data to student and analyze it.
Yeah.
The reflection questions. Thank you so much for sharing. And then I really appreciate sharing all the like publicly available data set for the audience. I think that will be very useful for the audience. Okay, we have some time for the questions. Um, in the Q&A, are you able to see the Q&A question, Travis?
Is that different than the chat? Oh, no, yeah.
I think the very first one is that one audience said, my challenge with the data feminism book, I think that one that you share is it takes a binary approach to gender, which would no, it's not. So this audience share that there is a queer data by Guyan. That is a better book. So it's just what about the comments?
Yeah, no, thank you for that comment. And I think that's an important one to think about. Because you're right, feminism usually is very focused on kind of, they try to open up the binary, but it is still usually very much from more of a feminist kind of perspective with that, which has been critiqued. Um, other things to open up that avenue too is there's an area of study called indigenous statistics. So think about indigenous perspectives on data. Quant crit is a growing kind of methodological approach where they're using usually critical race theory to question some of those things. And that's a common issue with any of the critical theories is that they often kind of focus on one specific issue and kind of unpack that. But if you think about like Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, or we think about, I often connect back to like Simpson's paradox, is that when we intersect and disaggregate data in different ways, we see a lot of these things are intersecting. There's a lot of overlap. The correlation, we can think of with an issue with that. So there's a lot of statistical issues that come up that also connect to these theoretical ways of thinking about it. And so that's a really important thing to think about. And then I see another question was, how do you balance between potentially psychological harm to a student with the importance of understanding and using the data? And that's a fantastic question. And I'll say I don't think there's a right answer for that. Techniques that I've used is one of them is we'll actually survey the students ahead of time if there's any issues that they would prefer to avoid or not talk about. Uh, we use this as a balancing act. We triangulate between different things. We will also say, here's some of the issues that we're going to talk about in class. Have you had personal experiences with these? So we try to get some opportunity to see ahead of time, is there going to be issues with certain ones so that we don't necessarily avoid it, but then we can know to be prepared for it. Or we can know which students do we maybe want to have a conversation with ahead of time. Do we need to switch up this topic altogether because it's not going to fit? Those are some of the ways that we've addressed it, but a lot of that is, again, getting to know your students, which again, in a 600-person lecture hall is challenging to do, but those surveys, those kind of pre-surveys, just like we survey students for interest, we'll survey them for issues that might crop up as well. So that's one of the ways that we deal with that.
Great. And then there is another question. Thank you so much for this informative presentation. I just graduated and would like to pursue more quantitative methodology courses, but I struggle with this very issue of relevance. I sit in the classes that I'm sure are excellent, but the data and example are irrelevant, so they become quite frustrating. I work in education. Do you have any suggestions for courses or institutions that I can apply to?
That's one you should probably email me about, and I can think about that a little bit more. As a general comment to that, I think that's a common challenge we face, right? Especially because a lot of our courses can be textbook driven, and textbooks are just inherent in how they're designed, dated, right? So some of the examples are trivial, or they're really just relevant to whoever wrote the textbook, or they're so broad that they're irrelevant to everyone. And that's why I think it's really important to then try to find some of your own examples. Now, I'm not gonna lie, it's a lot of work. I spend a lot of time finding data sets. But I also learn a lot through that experience. And so I think it's a worthy use of my time in a lot of ways. There are a lot of resources out there too that are trying to connect this more and more to instruction. There are some for education in particular, because education has as a research area is kind of shifted away from quantitative in certain ways. And not everybody that takes critical perspectives like me actually will acknowledge that you can study things with quantities. Like some people philosophically are like, no, you can't quantify things. So there's issues there, but that critical quantitative methods, there are some places, I want to say University of Maryland might have a program that delves into that, or a research center. Don't quote me on that, but I think they might have something there. Um, there's more. NSF has been funding more and more grants on trying to support researchers in kind of learning more about quantitative methodologies or methodologies in general. So there's a few of those out there too that I could recommend, not off the top of my head, but if I Googled really quick, I could find them. So those are some other things to look at too. There's also an interesting intersection of data science and educational research that's starting to happen, where you have data science for educational research, like the University of Tennessee has started a program around that. And I want to say either Stanford or Berkeley has been doing some work around that too. And I'm sure there's other spaces. These are just the ones that I think of. But really kind of opening up, instead of the very traditional, like we're going to collect a bunch of data and either do this like propensity score thing or some matched pairs design, like really thinking more openly about the data and what kind of big data that we can use in these settings. And what we can do with visualizing that data too, in different ways that can be helpful. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Any other questions? I have one quick question. We have
Yeah.
one. It was really good to know that it's better to focus on three types of data set during the semester, not just having multiple data set from different topic. But I've been using like multiple data sets from different topics. It's good to know about that. Just can you please share any like example of the data set that you use in this semester that you are teaching?
Yeah, so the common ones that I like to pull from is one is census microdata, because then you're looking at actual people's responses to the census, and there's so many different types of variables there. So especially if it's pulling from the American Community Survey, you get quantitative variables around income or like hours that they work a week, age. But then you also can get a lot of categorical data around, demographic information, spatial data, things like that. Um, so I find that like if you pull a micro data set, you can make it local to your area so that it's data on your area, but then you can still deal with a lot of different issues. And so I might only use a few attributes for each unit, right? So I'm focusing on categorical analysis, so I'm only using those, or I'm focusing on quantitative, or comparing between groups, or things like that. So that way, then I can use that one data set across multiple things. And so they've still got familiarity with the data collection that's gone on with this and the context of the data, but I can delve into different issues with it. The traffic stop one I use pretty regularly, just because I know it really well at this point, so it's easier to do that. And then weather data is the other one that I most commonly will delve into. And one of the reasons I like weather data too is that if you look at things like temperature data, or if you're looking at the amount of sunlight per day or things like that, it makes periodic patterns. And so students don't always see that, right? They're always trying to fit lines to everything. And you're like, well, what do we do with this? It's curved. And we have to think in terms of sinusoidal functions or things like that from a modeling perspective. So it helps kind of point to that. But everybody experiences the weather, right? So that's still something they can connect to. So those are like the three big ones that I typically do.
Great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think the time is up, but there is one question. Thank you for sharing your teaching expertise. Can you use your slides in our classes?
Yeah, you can use anything that's up here, you're free to use for whatever you want to. That's totally fine with me.
And then Travis shared the link for the presentation slides, so we're able to access that. Yeah, again, thank you so much for your time, Travis. Thank you for giving this amazing talk. And also thank you so much for attending this webinar. Thank you, the audience. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.